So, I want to talk this morning about randomness and self-blame and how understanding this concept, and I'll explain what I'm talking about in terms of the sort of randomness of the universe, how understanding this concept from a Buddhist perspective can lead to a decrease in self-blame. And we start with the nature of the universe, and we know from modern science that the universe is vast, that it's complex, and most importantly, that it's unpredictable. There's this sort of chaotic dance of subatomic particles, the sort of immense swirling galaxies. I mean, randomness is a fundamental characteristic of the cosmos, as the physicists and the astronomers and others tell us. And this inherent randomness can be unsettling to us because it challenges our desire for control and predictability. And you often hear me say that we humans hate unpredictability. But when we view this randomness through the lens of the Buddhist teachings, we can find in that profound wisdom and liberation. And you may ask why? Well, it's because this randomness confirms the law of impermanence. Everything in the universe is in a constant state of flux. Nothing remains unchanged. And through this understanding, we recognize that many events in our lives are also the result of randomness, of countless interconnected causes and conditions that are far beyond our control. And this is known in the Buddhist teachings, this interconnectedness. The term is dependent origination. You may have heard me use that term. But according to the principle of dependent origination, every phenomenon arises from a complex web of interdependent factors. And it's a pretty complicated concept that I'm not sure I wholly understand, but it basically says that everything is connected and interdependent. And when we embrace this idea, we can begin to see that the outcomes in our lives are not simply the result of our own personal decisions or our own personal choices, but instead they're shaped by this intricate interplay of actions and decisions and circumstances, and most of which are random and unpredictable. And I find this realization incredibly freeing because it really helps take away so much of the self-blame that we put on ourselves, so much of the responsibility for outcomes that we put on ourselves. Self-blame often stems from this illusion of a permanent, independent self. And this is where the Buddha says, no, that doesn't exist. He talks about this concept of non-self. But when we view ourselves as discrete entities responsible for everything that happens in our lives, the tendency towards self-blame is going to be great. But this perspective is inaccurate, and it also can be a source of tremendous suffering because we're always blaming ourselves for outcomes. But if we recognize the impersonal nature of the universe and the interconnectedness of all things, we can begin to dissolve this illusion and let it go. So just consider this scenario. We diligently apply for a new job. We go to the interview, but despite our best efforts, we don't get the job. And the immediate reaction is to blame ourselves. What did we do? Why weren't we good enough? What mistakes did we make? We go through a whole litany of things that we messed up on. But when we apply the principles of impermanence and dependent origination, it broadens the picture. It creates some spaciousness. Maybe the company's needs changed. Maybe there were more qualified candidates. Maybe our salary demands were too high. Maybe the interviewer was having a bad day. There could be any number of explanations other than the fact that I messed up. Now, I may have messed up, but many factors beyond my control influence the outcome. But I focus on only my own perceived mistakes because my ego sees this experience through a very limited perspective. But if I embrace the broader perspective, I can let go of some of that self-blame. I can cultivate a greater sense of equanimity. And equanimity, as you know, is a state of calmness and balance, sort of going with the highs and lows without getting knocked too far off balance. So when we understand that the universe operates through this complex web of causes and conditions, we approach life's challenges with greater acceptance, greater forgiveness, and less self-blame. Now, having said all that, I'm not saying that we abdicate responsibility for our choices and our actions. Our path, of course, emphasizes ethical conduct, skillful choices, mindful living, but it also teaches us to discern between what we can control and what we cannot control. And by focusing on our intentions and efforts rather than outcomes alone, we cultivate a healthier and more compassionate relationship with ourselves. So we do the best we can, but instead of always judging ourselves by the outcome, we feel less self-blame, less self-criticism. And when we practice mindfulness, we become aware, as we've been talking about lately, of our thoughts, emotions, and reactions. And we can see them more clearly. We learn to observe them without judgment. And we see them as impermanent and transient phenomena. And this awareness also helps see these patterns, these habits of mind that involve self-blame, and gently let them go. In addition, we practice self-compassion, as we often talk about. We acknowledge we're doing the best we can. Self-compassion, as taught by the Buddha, involves treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer to a dear friend. When we acknowledge that we are a part of this vast, unpredictable tapestry, a tiny part of this vast, unpredictable tapestry of the universe, we approach our imperfections and mistakes with greater gentleness. The random of the universe, when understood through the Buddhist lens, offers a path of freedom from self-blame. By recognizing the impermanent and interconnected nature of all things, we release the illusion of a separate controlling self that is wholly responsible for all the outcomes. We just don't have control over that much of these outcomes. Yes, to some extent, but it's not a huge chunk. Instead, we cultivate equanimity, mindfulness, and self-compassion, and this leads to a more balanced and harmonious way of living. So by understanding and embracing this randomness, we create spaciousness around our decisions, and more importantly, we create spaciousness around the outcomes of our choices and decisions. So that is randomness and self-blame.